Hello, welcome to Interaction Design Modeling Materials Module 1 Tutorial 1. This tutorial is an introduction to Cinema 4D. Our agenda for today, we're going to look at what is Cinema 4D, we're going to look at how to download and install Cinema 4D, and we're going to look over the C4D user interface and layout. So what is Cinema 4D? C4D is 3D modeling software. It is extremely powerful and a standard in several industries. If you have any experience in 3D modeling, your first question may be, why are we not using Blender, which is also a powerful 3D modeling tool, but it is free? And the answer is version stability. Cinema 4D offers version control. So once we start creating tutorials and resources in our classes, we can count on those tutorials being supported in the future through the software. Free tutorials like Blender are notorious for big user interface changes, the kind that change everything all at once and make using tutorials difficult or impossible. We can't build academic resources that can change without notice. Our labs all have licensed copies of Cinema 4D, but if you need to access it off campus, there is an inexpensive Cinema 4D student license, which you can download for a 6-month licensed copy onto your personal computer. You will need to update your license every 6 months, but otherwise it works as a full version. We will next go through this process of downloading and installing Cinema 4D here. So if you want a local copy on your laptop or home computer, follow the next steps, otherwise you can jump ahead. This introductory tutorial is longer than most. The tutorials will be shorter once you are familiar with Cinema 4D, the layout, and the user interface. Let's look at downloading and installing it. Head over to maxon.net/try, and we're going to download the current Maxon app for your operating system. This is Maxon's licensing app. From here you can decide what kind of products to download and install, and then which license is correct for your purpose. You can also follow the link, which will take you to the educational licenses link. This will take you to a third-party company called Kavuto, and at Kavuto you can then add the license to your shopping cart. You can then purchase it, and Maxon will send you a license. Let's look at that process right now. At maxon.net/try, you can see that you can download the Maxon app. Consider this app like a hub, and from this hub you can control all of the different licenses that you have on your own computer. When you access Cinema 4D on the lab computers, you won't have to worry about this process. When we use the link to look at the Maxon educational licensing, you can see that they have different licenses for student, faculty, and schools. Scroll down and you'll see a link here for Get Started at Kavuto. And at Kavuto, you can see that you can order a student license. This tutorial is actually being built with the student license. My Sheridan laptop, I have a provided copy that is through the school, but because I like to record my videos on my home computer, I also pay for a $9.99 student license to use at home. And you can see that I have already ordered this product. But it is actually this easy to add to cart. You will have to pay for it. And once you do pay for it, you will get an email confirmation confirming that you have a licensed copy, so that when you then open up the Maxon app, which we will look at next, you will be able to see which licensed pieces of software you currently have. Once you've downloaded the Maxon app and you've licensed a copy from Kavuto, open up the Maxon app, whether you're on a Mac or a PC. And when you do, you'll see that you can look at all of the different products that you have licensed and installed. This is what you want to make sure is looking exactly like this, Cinema 4D up to date. And this means that you have a licensed copy of Cinema 4D installed on your home computer. Next, we're going to look at the user interface. This current layout you're looking at is the updated 2023 layout. There are a series of these different layouts, and they're available. If you select this new layout key, you'll notice that you can go to Model, and this is what the older layout looked like. So if you're looking at any older video tutorials on YouTube or Lynda, and it looks like this, and you're having trouble finding things, this is actually the reason. But simply by selecting the new layouts and standard, we can jump to the updated layout, which is the one that we're going to be currently working with through these tutorials. So now as we look down our dynamic palette, you can see that there's a series of these icons that are available, and these icons are going to change depending on which function you're working on. Right now we have it set on model mode. Above that you can see that there's a magnifying glass icon. This is the commander, and if I select that, you can see that there's a search bar, and from here you can search for any type of function or attribute that you want, and that might be really helpful if you're on a video tutorial outside of these tutorials and having trouble finding something. Above that you can see that there's an undo and redo buttons. These are going to allow you to toggle back and forth between your workflow. So if you want to change something or go back, or you've made a mistake, this is where you'd be able to do that. Beside these icons, you're going to find the asset browser. And by clicking the asset browser, you can see that it adds a new window, forces over your viewport. In the asset browser, you'll find that Cinema 4D has a series of objects and materials and example scenes, all available for you to use. This will be a little bit overwhelming at first, but you're going to find that there are times where being able to add some kind of light or environment or material that's already pre-built can be very handy. And to make it go away, just click it again, and you get your viewport all back to yourself. To the right of this are the axis locking icons. Remember that we're talking about a viewport that we're going to have objects and environments that we're building in. So there are times that you might want to have to lock one of the directional axes. And you can see that in fact the red, green, and blue, the X, Y, Z axis, each have a corresponding angle here that allows you to lock it. Closer to the center on the top, you're going to see some of the main features we're going to work with, where we have point mode, edge mode, polygon mode, and model mode. We also have texture mode, which is one of the newer ones. We will work with this a little bit, but certainly we're going to mostly be working with these other ones as we learn to model. Every time you change into one of these modes, again, you'll notice that it adjusts what icons are available in the dynamic palette. You'll find that over to the far right of the viewport here, we have our render view, render to picture viewer, and our render settings. And I'll show you how to use each of those. Beside that is the material manager. On the far right, here we have the objects manager, and at first there's nothing in it, so it's hard to make sense. Let's put something in our scene so that it starts to make sense. I'm going to click on a cube. You can see that immediately we have a cube in our scene, and we have a cube in our objects manager window. In the window, we can control that cube, we can move it around, and in the objects manager, you can see by clicking off and on the cube, our attributes change. So our attributes manager allows us to look at some specific things about this cube. It's 2000 by 2000 by 2000 millimeters. So for instance, if we were to create a second cube, which you wouldn't see until I move it, you can see that now we have two cubes, and we can jump back and forth between them. Each one right now has identical attributes. But if we were to change the attributes, which we can do either here or in the window itself, you can see that now we can identify the two of them much more clearly. And as we create different objects and connect them together, the Object Manager and the Attributes Manager allow us to see and control any of these objects that we create. In the Material Manager, which is this icon here, I'm just going to adjust that window slightly, we can create different materials that we might want to add to our objects. So for instance, I've now made a gray material, which is the same as the material that's there. By coming down into the Attributes Manager, I can adjust that material. So let's say we want to change that color. And we can make all sorts of different adjustments to it. And then drag it directly onto the object. And as soon as I drag that material onto the object, you can see that in the Objects Manager, it's added the material as a tag. We can create a second. And it's that easy to add materials to an entire object. We can close our Material Manager when we're not using it to get more access to our viewport. But anytime you want to create a material, add a material, that's how you do it. Some of the most important tabs run between the viewport and the Objects Manager. These are our Objects and Deformers tabs. We can create a series of different kinds of objects. Our blue tabs then are different objects that we can create in Cinema 4D. Beneath the objects, you see that we have these green tabs. These are generators. And if I hold this down, you can see that it opens up a series of different options. And these are going to generate some specific changes. Sometimes they will add an array. When we talk about a bool, we're subtracting and adding geometry together, which will make a lot more sense once we start playing with a couple of the objects. Beneath that, and we have a few of them, are the deformers. And the deformers are going to allow us to directly change some of these objects, adding bends, tapers, bulges, this kind of thing. Again, once we start playing with this will make a lot more sense. We can add sky, we can add a camera, and we can add lighting. And again, these will be things we start playing with and will make a lot more sense as we go. We've talked about the attributes window, which will become, again, a lot more clear and really specific depending on the object we're working with. And coming full circle at the bottom, you'll see that we have an actual timeline window. And this timeline window is made for when we're animating. We're not going to be teaching animating directly in any of our coursework for this module. I know you're going to be doing it in other courses though, so you'll be able to feel free to add animation in some of the work you do here. We're not going to be covering it specifically, which brings us right back around to our dynamic palette on the left side. As part of the workflow of Cinema 4D, I want to bring your attention to the document file system. Up at the top, you can see that I have this as Untitled 1. If we create a new file, which is very similar to when we're working with a lot of Adobe products, you can see that we can just create a new viewport. This seems really intuitive, and it is intuitive for us. It's actually a new thing. Cinema 4D didn't work quite this easily or streamlined, being able to jump from scene to scene. This can often be very important as we build a series of different assets and then move them into a common scene. Next, let's look at how we can navigate inside the actual viewport, because it can be a little tricky at first. Let's simplify our scene, get back down to our one basic cube. Actually, let's start from scratch. and it'll be easier to see what I'm doing by just simply adding in a basic cube. Moving around the scene, you're going to use specific buttons and icons. It isn't just as simple as for instance, if I hold down my mouse, you can see that I start dragging the object around, which is not what we want to do. And if I go off of the object, I can hold down my buttons and nothing happens. If I hold down my one button on my keyboard, however, I can now drag my scene back and forth. You can also do this if you hold down this hand icon and then move your mouse. Similarly, if I use the scale icon and I drag it back and forth, I can move in and out with my camera. I can do the same thing by holding down my number 2 on my keyboard. I can drag back and forth. If I hold down my orbit camera, you can see that I can actually orbit around the scene with the camera. And if I hold down number 3 on my keyboard, I can do the same thing. So you get used to these sort of faster ways of doing things using your keyboard, but it is a combination of using your mouse and keyboard. If you're using just a trackpad, you might find it's easier to use these icons. You might find it's easier to use the keyboard. I would suggest if you don't own a mouse, you might want to think about purchasing a mouse to make this a lot easier. Now, all of these controls we've used are camera controls that allow us to move around our object. None of them actually change the object or deform the object. If we want to move the object, this is where we get into using our dynamic palette, and it also has its own shortcuts. So the first thing is, of course, if you've been pressing any of these buttons and right now you're confused because this isn't working, you need to be in model mode and selecting my cube. If I want to adjust anything about this object, I would want to use these specific icons. I have a move icon, a rotate icon, and a scale icon. My move icon allows me to, well, it should allow me to move the full object. There we go. And you can see that what I did there is, and by moving in, I have a little more control. There are control bars, and the control bars actually allow me to change a specific size attribute that way. But in fact, I'm trying to grab this red bar, which moves the entire object. And it works the same way with any of these. So I can move up and down, but if I want to move the actual attribute, which in this case would be to change the size of any one of those different sides, I would do it that way. Rotate, you can see that I now have my axes showing, and I can grab one of these axes and I can adjust my object in any direction I want. I can Control Z or go back, so I'm at the basic, and I can again still control the scale of these. It's funny, because when I go to scale, this is actually where I can control. Now, right now we're working what's called a parametric object. It's a primitive, and both of those words you're going to find are used interchangeably when you're talking about modeling. What this actually means is it's a very simple object. It's a basic object. It has vectors that are in the corners, and in those vectors it's filled in around it, and that's about all. So as I'm scaling, right now it's trying to scale the entire object, but in fact if I grab those little handles, I can control it much more precisely. Now I can still do that with the attributes manager if I choose to. So there's a few different ways we can do this, and you can see that in the attributes manager I can be very, very precise, right? Here I'm just sort of eyeballing it in my scene, but in the attributes manager I can actually, if I wanted to, well, this one is set to 1.2 millimeters. Let's make it 2 millimeters. Oh, No, it was set to something far bigger than that. So right now I've set it to 2 millimeters and it's tiny. Let's set it back to, let's say, 1,000 millimeters. There we go, right? So we can be really precise, 5,000 millimeters, and there we go. So we can now adjust things right in the attribute window. We don't have to do it here if we don't want to, which is certainly going to be more organic in how we do it and less sort of precise and mathematical how we do it. As we start to work with objects and we start to rotate and change them, sometimes things can get more complicated. So let me give you this example. I've rotated this object so that now you can see that, in fact, if we look at its move, you can see that if I go to move it, it will no longer move up and down. It has its own axes. So when we talk about the axis of an object, the axis of the object moves when we rotate the object. And that can get way more complicated, because if we then also rotate it this way, and I go to move, you can see that now it's going to want to move on an angle, right? So what if we wanted to move this up and down? So there's a really, really simple trick in Cinema 4D which allows us to change our axes from our world axes to our object axes. And it's this icon right here. And by clicking this, I can now move the object up and down in my scene. Because for me, the scene might be the important axis and the object has its own axes. You see? Sometimes if you get stuck with something like that, that's a way around it. Another quick trick is sometimes in Cinema 4D, it's very easy to lose track of an object. So let's say you're working on an object, something like this happens, and suddenly you have a blank, and you might even not recognize. So what I just did there is I'm using my center mouse button as a scroll, and I can find the object, but sometimes it's harder to find the object. And what you can do specifically is if you press H, it will frame all of the objects in the scene. In this case, we only have the one object, but it'll frame it. If you've selected an object, you can select, let's say you have a few of them, you can press O, and it will actually, you know what, here, let's move that object over there, and I'm going to press O, and it'll select it again. So H and O allow you to get back to right where you want in either the scene or the object itself. We've covered a few of our control icons for our objects. We've covered a few of our camera objects. You'll notice that there's another icon here that we haven't really looked at yet. This is our active view, because Cinema 4D allows us to look at multiple views simultaneously. So right now we have a perspective view, we have a top view, we have a right view, and we have a front view. And by scrolling out a bit, you can actually see that in fact the objects are there. I've just moved them away from the center. So it's possible to then, well, if I start now, I'm actually moving the object around here, and what I really want to do is just, again, each one of these you see has its own sort of pan and orbit and dolly, which is the camera views of these. So I can then zoom in. And you'll notice, though, that each one of these, not only does it have its own control, but you notice that it looks very different, where it's a wireframe. And in fact, Cinema 4D has several different ways of viewing objects. And so right now you can see in this one, we're actually viewing a shaded object. So how do we change that? If we go into our display option, you can see that this one is set to garage shading, and you can see that this one is set to lines. So if we change this to garage shading or garage shading on all of them, this is not actually my preferred one. My preferred one is with lines. And you see with lines that it immediately adds the lines between vectors. And what this allows us to do is, even as we orbit around, we can very clearly, easily see every one of the sort of poly surfaces that's available. Now, This allows us that if we want to go to anyone in particular, right, we can change that. So in our viewport, it allows us to change our view. Normally, these would be much flatter, and what I mean normally, what I mean by that is I've really adjusted the orbit in this one. So let's get rid of that for a second, and let's add a fresh, whoops. Let's add a nice, fresh, simple cube again. And then from here, I can move that to the center. From here, I can move that to the center. And from here. Now, of course, a cube is going to be the same on every side. So in this view, it isn't going to really show what's different about what's happening here. But as soon as I were to add something like a rotate, you would see that it would actually start to change all of them based on whether you were looking at it from the right, the front, or the top. This is extremely important when we want to do precise work, like say put a hole directly through our object in some way, right? And by doing that, we're going to want to make sure that the hole is controlled and able to go in a specific direction from one side to the other. That again is a specific use case that will become much more obvious as we go along. And this takes us to the end of our first tutorial on Cinema 4D. So our takeaways. In this tutorial, we've covered what Cinema 4D is, how to download and install a licensed student copy using the Maxon Hub, and covered a basic intro to the user interface and layout so you can move forward with more confidence as we start learning how to model in subsequent tutorials. See you next time.